Доброго дня.
Good afternoon. The Ukrainian Crisis Media Center starts the discussion on the topic taxation for agrarian producers, what could be changed. It is organized by the Ukrainian Crisis Media channel within the USA Dobre program. It is broadcasted via social media on Facebook pages of Dobre, Decentralization, Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, and on YouTube of Ukrainian Crisis Media Center. Since the early June, the agrarian community has been discussing the decision of the Parliamentary Committee to support Draft Law 3131 on deshadowing of agricultural production, and on the 9th of June, the Parliamentary Committee changed their decision and supported the updated version of the draft law. And today, with our speakers, we're going to discuss whether this legislative initiative will contribute into deshadowing of land ownership and agricultural production, and whether it will influence the development of rural communities and contribute to growth or economic growth, or will rather be an obstacle for micro farms. Hopefully, we will discuss all of that with our speakers, and today we have here an MP of Ukraine, member of the Committee for Finance, Taxation and Customs Policy, Ms. Yuzhanina, Mr. Dmytro Kokhan, advisor of the All-Ukrainian Agrarian Council, focusing on relations with public authorities. We also have here Mr. Nivievskyi, professor of Kyiv School of Economy, John Mills, team leader for EU project support for agricultural and food policy, and Mr. Shafranovich, head of Ivanivska Amalgamated Territorial Community, and Volodymyr Semenyuk, individual farmer. So if you have comments to other or questions to other speakers, you're welcome to come up with your reactions either in the chat box on Zoom or on the screen. So Nina, let us start with you, because you work with us, you stay with us for 45 minutes, and then you have to go back to the parliament. So my first question to you is this. For the general public, and today we have mostly here representatives of local governments, regional media. We also invited entrepreneurs, farmers to join the discussion. So who is the draft law 3131 for? And very briefly on the versions of this draft law, and if you believe that it will really contribute into deshadowing the incomes and land ownership for agricultural producers. First of all, thank you for engaging me into this discussion, because it is obvious that we should have started this discussion much earlier, before this draft law has been drafted, in order to find out who needs that, and if it is needed to introduce any amendments to taxation legislation to start combating the shadow market in this sector. I have several questions to representatives of local communities, and maybe I should address this question to them first, and then we have the discussion. So my question is whether you believe that you need support at the national level. I mean, if you need those amendments to taxation laws, so that you in the field could control the payment of the land tax, and in that way to ensure revenues to local budgets. So if you are managing so far, if the situation is under control, if you understand the situation fully, if you have all of that information available, which portion of lands are cultivated officially or unofficially, which is used for agrarians to produce agricultural products. So do you have this information in the field, and do you need support there from the national level? So could we please hear answers from our local representatives? Do we have here Mr. Ruslan Shafranovich, head of Ivanivska Amalgamated Community? Maybe if you heard the question, could you address that, please, Ruslan? Then Volodymyr Semenyuk, could you please respond to the question from the MP? And you need to unmute yourself. I'm not a lawmaker. I'm an individual farmer. At the level of amalgamated community, I can hardly answer this question if we need that or not. Maybe the mayor or leader of the community could answer that question. Now, Mr. Ruslan, did you hear the question from Ms. Yuzhanina? Mr. Shafranovich, head leader of Ivanyevska Amalgamated Territorial Community. Did you hear the question from Nina, or maybe we should repeat it now? Obviously, they don't hear us. Okay, but actually, there are a lot of issues, and we need to start addressing them from the standpoint of local governments, and that would be right. Because here in the good afternoon, so maybe we should now pass the floor to Ruslan. Ruslan, could you join us and give us a sign that you hear us? No, obviously there is no connection, so let's go on. So I mean that for many years we've been having this discussion about how the agricultural products are sold along the chain, production chain, and what kind of violations of taxation laws are committed when selling products if the products are grown illegally or if the production is illegal or unofficial. So the agricultural producer not renting any land, they grow product or produce something and then they sell it. So what happens along that chain at the level of at the national level and at the level of local budgets? So when I talk to people who know what happens well, you do see a lot of issues there. And I was quite impressed recently by an interview of the new head of the state taxation service about how much VAT is kind of sold from the budget, is not transformed into revenue to the budget, and that it becomes possible to a great extent due to turnover of illegal agricultural products. So he mentioned the figure of 25 billion, and that's huge for the Ukrainian budget. What does that mean for agrarian producers and for local budgets? I would like to discuss that aspect. If you do have this perception of what's happening in the country, if we speak about unofficial, informal agricultural products market, if it does exist or not, that market, and again, going back to my first question, do you really believe that at the national level we need to somehow interfere to regulate the situation, to amend the laws, so that at the local level eventually it were possible to sort out who needs to pay local taxes like land tax and the land rent, and who doesn't need to pay that? Or are there any disbalances there? So this is the main question that needs to be addressed. Dear colleagues, well, I believe we will not try to have this discussion now. Mr. Oleh, are you ready to join the discussion? Maybe you can answer the question from Ms. Yuzhanina, and then we will hear colleagues from amalgamated communities. Yes, good afternoon. If we speak about what needs to be done at the central level, at the national level, to reduce the shadow informal market for agricultural products or informal rent, well, yes, I do believe that something needs to be done at the national level. The only thing is that, sure, that shouldn't be minimal tax liabilities. I could focus a bit more on that in my part of the presentation. But if we speak about the central level, the national government, a lot of things could be done. above all in the field of legislative framework, law drafting, and actually a lot of things are work in progress now. For example, draft law 2194, where state-owned land is going to be passed over to communal property, to ownership of communities. I believe that's also a good initiative that will de-shadow the market. Then draft law 3295 on the Agrarian registry. That's another tool for de-shadowing of the agrarian sector. I would also like to add, well, again, speaking about minimal taxation load, I would like to see lawmakers withdrawing the 7-year minimal rent term that was introduced in 2015, because that is a significant source of informal production, because people do not want to rent their land for 7 years now. It is more convenient for them to work under 1 or 2 year contracts. And there are also a number of other products that result in informal production. What else needs to be done at the central level by central government? Above all, it is about analysis of the scope of informal production, the reasons for that. And I'm sure that the problem is not only at the level of farming, agricultural production. We need to consider the entire added value chain, the entire supply chain in the agrarian sector, because agrarian producers, especially small producers and independent farmers, we have many of them. We have millions of them, and they are suspected or accused of informal production. But what's their status in those supply chains? Nobody knows. There are these interesting stories, and I believe that the colleagues would agree with me, where at the level of procurement of agricultural products from independent producers, those who procure the products, they want to work using cash informally. And there, independent producers have no opportunity to go legal. And those who procure products, they have more impact, influence in the market. So we shouldn't only blame independent producers that they are criminals. No, that's too much. That would be too much to blame only them. We need to have a detailed discussion, and unfortunately, we didn't do that. We haven't done that yet. If we speak about the draft law, I don't know if I should go into detail now, or maybe we should leave it for later for my part of presentation. Thank you so much, and we will really get back to the draft law and your interpretation of that. Thank you, because you have really mentioned a lot of adequate aspects, and I absolutely agree with you there, because I still ask them to provide me with in-depth analysis for all the regions, for all categories of agricultural producers, on what kind of land is being cultivated and what are the ownership rights, rental terms and rental payments, the average payments by category of land and by district, so that eventually local governments, local authorities could also estimate, for example, the number of pensioners, of retired people who are definitely not required to pay the land tax at the national level, and which of them have rent their land illegally, unofficially, without contracts. That would be very kind of obvious and convincing, and that would give us some grounds for discussion. Now, I believe that in 2018, at the National Council for Reforms, Mr. Mikhail Sakharov then presented this concept on overcoming or combating informal turnover of agricultural products by means of taxation load. You are speaking about the absolutely adequate things. This should be the very last provision that needs to be enforced after We have done everything that we should have done in the country by now. Registries, databases, land transfer. A lot of preparatory work has been done, and only if all of these tools or instruments fail, only then we could switch to regulation by means of taxation. I absolutely agree with that. And when we discussed this draft law at the committee, I insisted, give me figures so that we could see what's happening, because without that profound analysis of the reasons why we do that, what for, and I actually mentioned that, we need to somehow overcome informal turnover that due to manipulations with documents result in this huge damages for the state, 25 billion, as somebody mentioned last year. So during this week, we have heard a lot of comments from experts of all levels, but not from and they agree that it doesn't really depend on the minor producer, independent producer. These documents, they do not really initiate those illegal practices. However, they grow the products that later requires this fake documents, etc. So as a result, we have this entire ecosystem or family of people who have negative reputation and who actually engage in this kind of criminal practices. So we should not really accuse the agrarian producers. We need to hear them, what they can suggest, so that we could at least start with some progress and start aspiring for some result. So let's forget about this draft law, I believe, in the context of today's discussion. Let's discuss if you recognize that the problem is there and that we need to start doing something in order to achieve the result. Because I'm sure that we cannot 100% get rid of that informal market, as well as in other sectors. Sure, we have informal economy in other sectors of the economy as well, somewhere up to 90%, so why should we start with agrarian producers? But I believe that we need to be fair. Let's just admit if the problem is there. Thank you, Nina. And it's clear that we're going to discuss all of those topics today, but the draft law, it's also a fact that has been voted for in the second version. Now I pass the floor to Dmytro. So the Agrarian Council actually supported the draft law 3131 and 3131D, both of them. So now you are going to comment on the main topic of our discussion, but could you also address this question? You and the Agrarian Council that you are speaking on behalf of, what do you think about programs to support microbusinesses and the very culture for development of microbusinesses in agriculture in Ukraine? Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you for inviting me here, and thanks to all the speakers and all those who are our audience today. Answering your question, and responding to Oleh, well, some say that independent producers are criminals. But let's not really say that, because independent producers, they are just micro entrepreneur as anyone else working in a small shop, in a kiosk, etc. So they create added value. They all create jobs for themselves, for their families, for other people. And small and medium businesses in normal countries, in civilized countries, for example, let's take the example of Poland, where they actually ground the economy on SMEs. So that's obvious. And us and the All-Ukrainian Agrarian Council, we absolutely support development of SMEs. In our case, it is small and medium farms. And a priori, I would not be able to answer that question, because All-Ukrainian Agrarian Council, that is an association of small and medium farms and farmers. So we do not have agrarian holdings as members, and obviously they have a different model and different realities, so we are not about them. We bring together more than 800 enterprises. We have several micro enterprises, but also small enterprises, 500 hectares, and more medium, 2,000 to 3,000 hectares, etc. So I believe I've tried to answer your question. Hope I've done that. And also let me answer the question of Nina Petrovna. I'm not a representative of local governments, but we work with them closely, our colleagues, the All-Ukrainian Association of Rural Communities. They also have their statement and their position there. Maybe they should also have been invited for this kind of discussion. And when I entered, actually, people said, somebody told me, let's keep it simple so that people could understand what we are speaking about. That was a request to me. So let's do that, and let us speak about the shadow business in the agrarian sector or in the Ukrainian economy in general. Is there the problem of informal processing? Yes, definitely. I believe everybody agrees with me, and later I will mention some figures. Is it comparable with a shadow sector, a shadow part in other sectors? Yes. For example, let's take salary or payroll. Using salary or paying salary when hiring employees. We could say that employees are production tools, they invest their labor, and the land in agriculture, it is means of production. So do we have the problem of informal salaries, where they pay either at the level of minimum wages or just pay in the envelope, in cash? Well, of course, we have that problem, and it is very obvious. In the agrarian sector, we have the same problem relating to the land. Either they officially pay something very low. I could see reports of companies where they pay 300 hryvnias per hectare, while based on statistical data, the average wages, average salary there is about 2,000 hryvnias. So it is actually avoiding paying taxes and the military fee, the war fee. And there are also cases where they do not pay anything officially. Everything is done based on cash. They say that the owner cultivates the land. It's the same as it happens with employment, as if nobody is employed, nobody does the job, and everything is paid in cash, nothing is visible officially, and nobody pays taxes. The same as for salaries. And local governments just have no instruments to control that. While for salaries we at least have the minimum wages, and the state sets the level of minimum wages, for land cultivation we don't have any tools like that. In addition to that, for salaries we have an authority that kind of looks for informal employment. This is state labor service. But for land, we don't have anything like that. Land for us is the main means of production. The agrarian sector of the economy, agrarian production in our country, happily, it is a very competitive market. It is competitive, among other things, because the potential of profitability is very high and the entry threshold is very low. It is not super simple, but you can go and get your 2 hectares and start production of berries or whatever. It only depends on your fantasy, imagination. So there are people who do that officially. And again, if we step back, I should mention that when the USSR collapsed, they partitioned those kolkhoz lands, collective farm lands, and as a result we have 7 million landowners. Some cultivate their own land, but a huge proportion of those people who are owners of that land, they rent it. That's the structure of the sector. Could you mention some figures? What's the number of people who rent officially and unofficially? Yes, let me mention some figures. In our country, we have 41.5 million hectares of agricultural land. Out of that, for the exception of reserve land or the land in urban territories, temporarily occupied territories, we have 32.5 million hectares of agricultural land that is supposed to be officially cultivated. And all of us know that in the country we don't have vacant land, that they are already kind of planting on the roads. You can go anywhere and you will see that we don't have vacant land that would not be cultivated or used. Based on data of the State Fiscal Service for 2018, as of then, all in all, the land where there is at least one tax, at least some tax paid, it was 20 million hectares. So obviously that 13 million hectares are in limbo. We don't know what's happening to that land. So 20 million legally and legally cultivated. Okay, then this figure for illegal cultivation, maybe that's about privileges at the national level, because we know that our pensioners do not pay the tax. I mean, how did you estimate that? If from the owner of a land plot there is no tax payment, you believe that that is illegally cultivated. But you know that there are so many people who don't pay taxes. I'm not speaking about land and tax. I'm speaking in general. 20 million, it is where they pay at least 1 kopeck. But for if you want to know where they pay some individual income tax, it is 25,000 hectares. That's it. I just mean that we need to have some grounds for that. We need to have some data. I cannot receive that from the State Tax Service or the Ministry of Finance, because they are supposed to receive this data from all territorial communities, from local governments. So I believe it would be important to see that figure. How many people and how much land do they have where they are 100% not required to pay the land tax? Second question would be if they cultivate their land themselves or they rent it officially or unofficially, but that's the second step. But now we just need to know how much land we have is owned by those people who don't pay, are not required to pay tax. Well, maybe we could take the example of Ivanivska community, and the leader of the community could come up with some estimations or statistics. So, Ruslane, what do you do about non-payers, the evaders? How do you work with those categories of people? And do you believe that these innovations, legislative innovations, would be important for you, because it's important for you to generate revenues to your budget? Can you hear me in very low? Well, I've been listening to these terrible things that you are discussing, and I'm thinking about where did you get those statistical data from? I was preparing for this discussion, and actually we have this information available because we try to keep the situation under control. So if we take the example of our small community, the area is 11,000 square kilometers, and we have about 10,000 hectares owned, and 80% are cultivated. So statistically, 8,000 hectares of land that is partitioned and rented officially. Out of this 8,000, taxes are being paid diligently. We also have 1,500 of kind of informal land or backyard land where they grow vegetables. And I believe we should not really bother about that. And we do have all in all 400 hectares, about 5%, that is problematic. And it is not fully problematic. I mean that out of these 400 hectares, 200 it is where people really cultivate their own land. And these are independent producers who, it's not that they don't pay anything, because we have quite high rate of land tax. What is that rate? About 3% versus the relative. So we receive about 1,000 hryvnias per hectare from independent producers. But there are also about 200 hectares and where we need to work on, where we cannot prove that whether they signed a contract, but even there they paid the land tax. So I believe that the problem is a bit inflated if you take the example of our community. And what to do about that? 2 years ago, we implemented the idea of increasing the interest rate, the payment rate to 5%. And you can do that at the level of local communities. So then why are we speaking about 50% of illegal land use? No, I don't agree with that. And if we speak about load per hectare, I have an enterprise that pays for 9,000 hectares of land. It's, it is 9,000, which actually includes the agricultural tax, social contribution, land rental payment, military fee, VAT, income tax. And this is an enterprise that, well, according to their accountant, the kind of payment per hectare for this enterprise is 9,000. So kind of fighting with those independent producers, I don't believe that would be reasonable for me. Because, okay, we have about 150,000 hryvnias of revenues to the budget from there, but what to do about those people who really cultivate their land, and for them paying 1,000 or 1,200 hryvnias per hectare would be too much, too burdensome. Well, I believe local communities have all the tools or all the opportunities to control the situation. Maybe we are lucky, but this is what we have. You mentioned that all in all it is about 1,000 hryvnias of tax per hectare. But what about those pensioners who own their land? But for agricultural production, they are not allowed to not pay taxes. Anyway, if even retired people, they pay for their land if it is agricultural producer. And when you speak about that kind of vegetable growing plants, it is up to 2 hectares. Yes. Well, that's very obvious, because if we speak about less than 2 hectares, it is up to local governments how they categorize that. Because some say that less than 1 hectare is for private use, and otherwise it is commercial production. So in order to actually resolve the issues relating to microbusinesses, this draft law was developed. I told to authors of the draft law that European Solidarity Party or faction will not support this draft law unless we have a good understanding of that us being in power, we created this form for independent producers as family farms, so that a family, when they kind of merge their lands up to 20 hectares, that they could pay 0.95% of tax as Group 4. And I believe that could give an important impetus for deshadowing, for those people to register their family farms, to sell their products without hiding, without cash settlements, where actually they launder money, those who procure these products. So to make it more official. But does this system for registration of family farms work in your community? Do people use this opportunity? Is it needed or not? No, people don't use it. Let me be straightforward. Moreover, they are not going to use that, because registering for 20 hectares, people just want to avoid to bother the nuisance. But that's not nuisance. You just go to a village council where the secretary stamps the family contract, and that's it. Well, I believe that you, at the local level, you need to convince people to register their family farms, even just for the sake of that it were possible for them to engage into various national programs that are being implemented by the Ministry of Economy and of Agrarian policy. It's necessary to use those tools that are available at the national level. I understand your skepticism, but I disagree with that, because people are socially not protected. They don't pay social contributions. They will not be able even to receive those minimal pensions, old age pensions. So it is important to promote those family farms. Could you please respond? And now we have Oleh Nivievskyi joining our discussion. I see that he is a bit fussy, so could you first respond? Well, believe me that we organized kind of meetings and we exchange experience of cooperatives and family farms, a lot of interesting formats. It's not that we are sitting doing nothing, but that's about the mentality, I believe. So far, people are apprehensive because there is no motivation, I believe. No motivation, just no need for them to bother. Okay, now Oleh Nivievskyi. You are rather critical, negative about 3131. What changed in positive sense in version 3131D? So could you please make it kind of clear for general public? So the shadow sector, reasons for that, equal tax load, who is this draft law for farmers, for small, medium farmers, whether it would affect those people who rent their land, whether their revenue or income at the end of the year will be lower. So could you try and answer these complicated questions, complex questions in a simple way? Wow, that would take me too long to answer all of those questions. You have 5 to 7 minutes. Okay, then very briefly about this minimal tax load, tax burden. Well, based on the current version of the draft law D, it is a certain percentage from the standard valuation, and that is for individuals, that is 2% now. The average estimation valuation is about 28,000 hryvnia. So per hectare, it could be estimated that the state should have some 1,200 hryvnias of tax. That is for legal entities, and at least 540 hryvnias per hectare for individuals who are not registered as enterprises, individual producers. So if you calculate how much taxes enterprises or individuals pay without VAT, if that is less than 1,200 per hectare or 540 for individuals, then it means that you need to pay the difference to local budgets. That's the idea. So per each hectare, you need to have that minimal amount of tax. This is the concept that was also present in 3131. It changed actually. They added two items, two provisions that you need to emphasize, if you know what I mean. Well, those two provisions, they are just about differentiation, but they will just kind of unify, bring together legal entities and individuals, and there is also the transition period kind of to make it possible for people to get used to that. Well, you know, it's interesting that the registered new version of the draft law was published on the parliamentary website only yesterday, but that's strange that we've been discussing it for a week. Why not register that immediately? Because it would be important to see provisions of the draft law. There are a lot of questions to that. So if I missed something, sorry for that, because it was just impossible to read into the document. Some actually of the provisions are very similar to what we could see a week ago, but I believe that basically the concept is unchanged, and I am rather negative about it. I have some economic arguments against that, and not only economic ones. Maybe I will mention some three messages now. First, something that I already mentioned, it is that I don't really like how they prepared analytical basis for implementing this legislative initiative. I believe that these initiatives need to be accompanied, supported with detailed analytical research, analysis, and unfortunately it was not done. I really love figures, and I like to see through them, but unfortunately I didn't see this kind of analysis, and lawmakers did not really estimate the consequences, the effect of this legislative initiative. And I believe that it would be very irresponsible in our country to do that. This is one thing, my one message. And even those figures that were provided, that 30% of agrarian land are illegally, are in shadow, I disagree with that, because that figure was based on two statements, and that was World Bank's satellite based research, but they only covered two districts in Ukraine, and their estimation was 28% of land cultivated not in correspondence with statistical data, with the statistical average. It was not about shadow as such, about informal activities. And then data of state fiscal service that were received at the request of MPs. And there they said that the fixed agricultural tax was paid from 40 million hectares of land, but it was in 1990s. So in 2011, all agricultural land, that was the what they grounded on, that in 2011 or in 2019, all agricultural land was cultivated by legal entities, but that's nonsense. So I believe that based on that information, it is not possible to make these important decisions. Going back to figures, the agrarian sector includes two categories of entities. This is legal entities and individuals. And actually, 40% is produced by households, by independent producers. 60% this is production by legal entities or registered entrepreneurs. So if we speak about the amount of land that they cultivate, well, actually 15 million of land it is cultivated by individuals, while 20 million it is legal entities. But it doesn't mean that 15 million is about the shadow, about informal procedures. Let me just finish with that, and then you comment, you provide with your feedback. So I believe that we can hardly say that 15 million hectares is informal sector. No, it's not quite, and it doesn't correspond to statistical data. So I believe that we have more problems with state-owned land. 3 million hectares, that is the shadow, if you consider at least the data that are available to me. So what I mean is that there is lack of analytical data. Then my second statement is that this kind of minimal contributions, this minimal tax burden, it is where we try to overcome the consequences, but not roots of the problem. We do not address the roots of the problem. Why we have this informal sector? There are a lot of roots to that. And that is, for example, the 7-year term of the contracts, rental contracts, problems along the supply chain. There are a lot of stakeholders who want to pay cash for agricultural producers. That's a problem. Then there is a problem of borrowings and repayment of loans, and that's the problem of the state. We had moratorium for 20 years, so we do not have this history where small farmers could use their land as collateral, as security, and thus where this independent producers could find these credit resources for further investments. Well, of course, they would be ready to sell unofficially, to invest into their production. So working with banks actually could also contribute into the shadowing process, but it's not being done. And Dmytro mentioned that for you farmers, they start, small farmers, they start with 500 hectares. But to me, they are not small farmers. This is quite a lot. So actually, I believe that you are speaking on behalf of medium producers. While banks, they do not offer loans for those who own less than 500 hectares, because that is too much nuisance. So that's about access to financial resources. Then we have a lot of problems about tax administration. Why farmers do not want to register as VAT payers, for example? Just because they don't want to have problems with tax office, tax administration, where they don't register tax bills, and where they have those NPLs that cannot be repaid. But it would be much more important for small farmers to have access to these funds, because for medium companies or farms, they have quite good staffing, while for small farms, that's a problem. And these are bureaucratic problems to a great extent. And this is, to some extent, an answer to Nina's question, why they don't want to register as family farms. Maybe Vladimir will disagree with me, but I believe that it looks easy on paper, but actually you do need to undergo some procedures that also creates some psychological and administrative barrier on the part of administration. And actually, generally speaking, considering the experience of the EU, I don't quite understand why we need this category of farms, but that's a different topic. So I believe that the problem of informal sector has not been properly explored. So we are fighting consequences, not the roots of the problem. And I've mentioned some of the ideas on how to deal with the roots of the problem. We could go into more detail, actually. Let me just mention that I represent the academic or expert community, let me mention that we did economic analysis of consequences for Ukraine of that recent draft law 3131, and I could share some preliminary estimations, projections. Based on our analysis, if we speak about effects on independent producers, potentially with this minimal threshold of 540 hryvnias, they could lose from 900,000 to 1,700,000 hectares of land. And actually, at the scale of Ukraine, this legislative initiative would cost the state, the government, a loss of from $9 million US dollars to 18.5 million US dollars of GDP. So the effects explain why I'm rather negative about this initiative. Thank you. Thank you. And speaking about the first part of your presentation, let us pass over the floor to Volodymyr, to independent producer from Ternopil Oblast. Could you speak about your tax burden and what you hear today from the experts, from the MP? So now the changes, amendments that are being prepared by the Verkhovna Rada. So do you believe that will contribute, that would make the situation better? Thank you. I absolutely agree with you. I'm not in the informal sector. I have 13 hectares and my family cultivate the land. My children work abroad, and what you say, that's right. Nobody wants to buy my products, elevators or bakeries, because they have their contracts, and when you want to sign contracts with them, they just take prices from nowhere. They just they pay some low prices, and then they pay much more at much more expensive prices in ports. So we do cultivate. We we produce meat and grain, and we have nowhere to sell that. When Tymoshenko was the prime minister, there were programs and there was some subsidies for cattle, but that is no longer available. So you're right saying that the informal sector, like for example, take sugar beet, plants do not want to buy my products because I am an individual. I find ways, I work with farmers to sell my sugar beet. In 1996, when there was this land partition process, in my village there were 25 landowners, and now it is just 3. The rest rent their land to holdings. We have a holding from Kyiv, and they have more than 1,000 hectares. And people, that's what they do. People come to us to cultivate land, and sure, if there's some old ladies, they would rather come to us. And I'm ready to pay taxes, but if the process is transparent, where I come to the state and I get a normal price for my grain or whatever, because I buy the input materials and I pay VAT, but nobody wants to buy grain at normal price. And while we have to incur our costs. So I agree. I pay tax 300 hryvnias per plot, and that's it. That's everything that I pay. I would agree to pay, but there should be a mechanism where, well, you're right, speaking about those family farms. well, we don't have family farms in our amalgamated community. We have larger farmers who are VAT payers, independent producers, but this mechanism where you could support us, because if you now take a land plot, my father is a pensioner and he has 2,000 hryvnias of pension, and we need to buy equipment, organic fertilizers, and of course, if I have to pay more for input materials than what I get from selling that. But if you were registered as a family farm, you would have the right to legally sell your products. Now you cannot do that. And actually, when we had the discussion at the parliamentary committee on that issue, I insisted on that they give us the information about what has been done in order to support the farmers for them to register those family farms. And I can read for you what the minister responded to me. Well, this support is possible, providing interest-free loans via a foundation for support of farms up to 500,000 hryvnias on repayable basis to use for stated designated purposes for up to 5 years with collateral. This is Regulation 1102. Then, as I mentioned, the support where for 10 years the state pays a social contribution for every household member at the level of minimal contribution, 650 hryvnias, and it is increased, and then the payment on the part, the contribution on the part of the farmer is increased only 10% a year. Then special subsidies for dairy cows, and the farm that owns more than 5 cows or more, if they are registered according to the law, and so on and so forth. We know that, actually. Okay, so why don't you use that? How could we help you? Because you need to tell us what needs to be done. Well, maybe that's about our kind of human factor, but our family will work on our own land, and last year we lost $100 per ton of soybeans, because you know that they buy cheaper, they sell at higher prices in the port. Well, this is what we need to avoid somehow. Okay, just for me to wrap up this discussion on my part, I believe that for these discussions we need to engage a wider community of stakeholders, and we need to have much more time for this discussion, because if we have touched upon this issue, we need to really hear each other. We invited a lot of farmers, independent farmers from various regions of Ukraine, and many people refused to join, and we are grateful to Volodymyr for joining us. We really try to engage a lot of stakeholders, and some were kind of apprehensive to deal with an MP, or some lack time, etc. Let me just wrap up some conclusions for our discussion as I see that. First, without analysis that we need to receive from public authorities, not just an association, though I respect the association a lot, without that we cannot move on. It is important to see why the speakers, the experts, they rather mention or have suspicions about state-owned land. We know how they were distributed, who has access to that, so we need to think about what to do there. Then there needs to be a systemic approach. Among other things, there should be some revision of the very function of the tax administration. If the tax administration is an impediment on the path of legalizing of formalizing these agricultural producers, because kind of family farms, they will be registered at controlling authorities automatically. So we need to avoid problems, because really I know that people, as soon as they encounter problems, they would do everything to stop that, because this is just a nuisance for their family, and this is a labyrinth that seems very complicated. So I address you as initiators, as those who work to support SMEs in agriculture. We really need to focus on those aspects that we discussed. So those who cultivate 15 or 50 hectares, this is our target. And if the law doesn't address that issue, we'd better halt and suspend the process. We'd better generate more support and better understanding, and only then we move on. Even though in the amended law, draft law, we go back to 1%, as it is now, the land tax rate for hay producers, for pastures, for multi-year plants, 2% for family farms, and you are right saying that 4.5 will apply to land cultivated by legal entities, and there is some grace period, there is transition period for adaptation. But will this tax liabilities address the issues? Well, there we need your contribution, because after discussion of all of these aspects in the framework of European solidarity, we decided that we will not support this draft law. Thank you for your time and for your opportunity, even though it is the last working week. Thank you for joining. Thank you. Unfortunately, we have not yet heard the fourth speaker, but I really need to leave, and there is a session of the committee. They are discussing very important issues, and nowadays about those who have mortgage loans. This is what we are going to discuss at our committee today. So sorry again, and have a fruitful discussion. Thank you. And it will be possible to see the video on the website of the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, and we will also come up with an analytical proceeding and a long read material. So we invite you to look through, to download these materials from the website of the Crisis Center. Now, Dmytro, let us go back to you. You already started with your contribution. I don't know if we need to mention more figures. Maybe we do. But now if we speak about fair taxation concept, where is that balance for SMEs? Before I answer that, I have a request to you, because I've been trying to interfere. Since in this discussion we had 5 speakers versus 1 here physically, let me be able to respond, to make it dialogue. We want our audience to hear all the parties to the discussion. Well, actually, apart from you or Mr. Nivievskyi, we didn't know the positions of our speakers. No, it's not about the distribution of speakers, but it is a discussion, so here we need to have kind of exchange. So now let us make a step back, because now we have deviated a lot, I believe. So for figures, I don't believe that we have problems there. We have 2 figures. One figure is 33 million that can be cultivated, and the second, well, responding to Oleh, 20 million, it is not owned by legal entities. It is where both legal entities and individuals pay something on that land. So this is actually about that gap where some cultivate their own land, but actually I have never seen those vegetable production plant in the backyard that would be 2 hectares. But it's not so much about those 2 hectares. Now they try to convey this idea that business is against the independent producers and they want to destroy them, but I absolutely disagree. We very much support development of farms, of agri companies, so that our industry were balanced to avoid the situation where we only have holdings or only SMEs. The only thing is that we believe that everybody needs to work legally, officially. That is key. Otherwise, if we say that some earn too little and there are problems with VAT and with some other rates, so it's okay if they don't pay their contributions, well, okay, let's take all people with low income where they receive less than 30,000 per year and say that, well, you don't need to pay taxes. That would be fair, because in villages you have village teachers where they have low salaries, but they pay their taxes because they are obliged to pay their taxes. But some may say that we cultivate our land and we don't pay taxes. So let's stop those manipulations. I mentioned this figure that for 13 million hectares, we have no idea what happens to that. And Oleg, you did your own research, I mean the World Bank research. They also mentioned 27% of vague area based on satellite pictures, where there is no document basis for that. Well, that was only 2 regions you mentioned, but I believe that the situation would be more or less the same for the other regions. And I really respect very much the head of the amalgamated community, and I am happy for you, but not everywhere the situation is like in your community, because we have a lot of members from Umань, for example, region and or district, and in some communities in that same district the situation is perfect, in some it is a catastrophe. I mean, well, the situation differs a lot. There are those farmers who come to us, who work with us to ensure that everybody pays taxes. Now, going back to that draft law 3131, no matter which version of that, because more or less they focus on the same goal, to set some minimum threshold for tax paying. And it's not about new taxes. It is about some threshold, the minimum that everybody is supposed to pay. And I believe that's fair, the same as for salary. There are minimum wages and you pay taxes on that. Maybe you receive part of that in cash in the envelope, but at least on that minimum wage you pay taxes, and that contributes to development of local communities. Now, speaking about independent producers, let's take recent data from 2019. We have 4.6 million households that own land. Out of them, 3.6% actually, they own 45% of all land that is owned by households. Out of them, up to 1 hectare, so 80% of all hectares own land plots less than 1 hectare. The rest, well, the average land plots for them is 15, 20, 25 hectares. And nobody says that we need to put more pressure on someone. Well, that's good that we have this instrument of family farms, we have national support or subsidy programs for farms. Maybe they are not efficient enough, they need to be amended, revised, but we have that. We have problems related to the VAT, and maybe we are less affected, but anyway, we have our ideas and we try to promote them. VAT for small farmers. And frankly speaking, in our country, in order to account for VAT, you do need to have an accountant. And we have some ideas how to make it easier for small farmers. But again, let's not hide non-payment of taxes, tax evasion, with some other problems that we have in the country. We need to go by and resolve them. Thank you, Dmytro. Now, just my last statement here, just my last statement about who pays what. For all land that is owned by individuals, that they register as where they are individuals, they sell their products by paying taxes or not. So again, we have 3% of large households that own 70% of or 45% of all land owned by households. This is 5 to 7 to 15 hectares, and they are obliged to pay taxes, but a bit in total, they paid last year a little bit more than 1 million hryvnias. And here we speak about 5 hectares and more. This is the reality. I mean, this is like 30 kopecks per hectare or what? Oleh, you wanted to join the discussion? 2 comments on my side. Dmytro is right speaking about household-related statistics. The number of households that cultivate more than 1 hectare is about 1 million. This is the sector that produces agricultural products. That's significant, and we shouldn't neglect that. On the other hand, this minimum tax, well, if we speak about your analogy with salaries, this is the same where whether you earn $10,000 or 100 hryvnias, you are obliged to pay some fixed amount, no matter what your income is. Is that fair? I don't think so. It doesn't take into account how much they earn. It doesn't matter if there was a drought or they just started their production. Nobody cares. Anyway, you need to pay your minimum tax. I don't believe that is in line with the economic theory, or it goes counter to practice. I don't understand that idea of minimal tax payment. Thank you. Though in the explanatory note to the draft law, it is stated that it is a fair taxation system for agrarian producers. Well, that's the objective. Fair, it is where you have 5% of tax and you earn your 100 hryvnias and you pay 5 hryvnias. Or, well, that's fair. But if you earn 100 hryvnias and you pay 50 hryvnias, no matter what happens to you, that's not fair. Okay, what would be a fair system of taxation for agrarian producers? Could you just state that? Well, let me just answer that question. And I believe that we have here Volodymyr, independent producer. Could I address a question to you, because you actually work in the field? So how much could you earn per hectare? Could you mention some tentative figure? What could be the average income from per hectare? If it is wheat, it could be 5 tons. If it is soybean, it is 4 tons. But what about money? I mean income, monetary terms. Per hectare? Last year, they bought wheat for 350, and so all in all, it is about 17,000 hryvnias per hectare. But this is actually what they paid to me. Let's go one by one. So, Volodymyr, I mean, 17,500, it is where I need to further pay for fuel, for seeds, for fertilizers, chemical treatment. So all in all, it boils down to very little amount. But little is how much? On average, without exact figures. Well, to me, it is like 2 tons of wheat per hectare. I mean, out of 5 that you actually have, 2 gives you income. It is about 7,000 hryvnias. Yes. So you see, this is actually what they have left. And according to this draft law, during the first 2 years, they don't pay anything extra. Starting on year 3, they pay 2%. It is 500 hryvnias if it is 7,000. You mean if the law is enacted in 2021, then in 21 there will be 0 rate for those who register as enterprises. Years 21, 22 it will be 0 rate, and 23 it will be 2% payment. So on average for the country it is 28,000 that they pay per hectare, so it is about 560 hryvnias. And if you count it for 7,000 of your income, it is 8%. But let me remind you, Dmytro, that the percentage of income that is paid by agri companies, it is very minor, it is ridiculous. So it depends on what you compare that with. The income that is generated by Volodymyr, for example, there the taxation needs to be compared versus taxation for agrarian companies, for legal entities. Those companies that are in category 4, they pay about 300 hryvnias per hectare. 300 hryvnias per hectare. And that includes the land tax. It's about 140 hryvnias on average. So actually, taxation of profit of agri companies, it is so low. So if we speak, well, here you speak about 8%, while companies pay so much less. That's not fair. Well, frankly speaking, I believe that we are mixing things up. We're confusing things now. But we would like to discuss the issues that are relevant for all stakeholders. But now, again, my question to Volodymyr, who is an independent producer, and I respect that their family, they produce their own, they cultivate their own land. And so if your land tax is about 130, so it is, all in all, it is 430 hryvnias per hectare. Well, while Volodymyr is counting, could you respond to Mr. Nivievskyi's question? What will large enterprises pay there, or companies? Well, look, based on our organization, on average, well, we are discussing this idea, what should be included as taxes that are paid by farms. We believe that if farms cultivate their land, they have officially employed people, they pay salaries, and the company or the farm is a tax agent. So they need to pay taxes for their employees. We believe that these taxes can be included into the amount that the company generates in respect of tax burden. there is single tax, that's obvious, or should a social contribution or military fee be included? Well, we believe that where a company buys a hectare, buys some products, hires people, buys fertilizers, hires vehicles, then they harvest, etc. So there, per hectare, the company, well, it's not so much about the company, but about that they need to have some minimum payment per hectare. They need to pay to the budget. So based on our on figures estimations for our companies, that's going to be about 2,000 hryvnias. So some members of our organization, if the draft law is enacted, then they will need to pay more. However, there is an example. I have a friend who has come back from the anti-terrorist operation, and he got his 2 hectares, and then 2 people came to him to ask him to rent this land. One came up with an official offer, another one with unofficial one. And of course, he rented to an unofficial guy because the income would be much higher. And really, our companies are ready to pay extra because you need to have adequate conditions or rules of the game where kind of they use informal or unofficial or criminal ways to convince the farmers. Okay, Mr. Semenyuk, you will respond now, but we also have here Mr. John Mills. Could you please join our discussion as well? So first Volodymyr, then John. Last year, I paid 286 hryvnias per hectare. Per hectare, 1.77 hectares. So I pay tax per plot. So I pay 283 hryvnias to the bank. That is in Lanievka, and I have a bit more land in another village where they are not yet amalgamated community. There I pay a bit more. But in amalgamated community, I pay 286 hryvnias per plot. And my plot is 1 hectare 77. But initially, you said that your local people come to you to cultivate your land. Do you pay taxes for those kind of workers? Yes. There was a decision of district council on taxation on services that are provided for land for agricultural producers, and we paid 600 hryvnias per month, as far as I remember. So all in all, to me, it was 600 hryvnias, but it was back in 1990s. But what about now? Now you are going to harvest. No, I only cultivate my land. It's not about that. I mean, do you work alone or you have some people coming to help you? I work alone, and you cover 13 hectares. Okay. I don't have employees. No, I operate my combine or tractor or everything. And just to add to what Volodymyr mentioned, he mentioned that, but you remember that he also pays VAT, while agri-businesses, they do not pay VAT. They have it refunded, while he has his tax burden much higher in that respect. Now, John, can you hear us, John? Could you please join the discussion now? I will not ask you to analyze the Ukrainian legislation. However, could you share international experience of work with the informal agrarian sector? And also, could you maybe comment on which of the countries that you're going to mention had this informal sector, and what was the way that they resolved the problem?
All right, thank you. No, I can't comment on your particular tax because there is no common tax policy in the European Union. Every country develops its own tax system. So I'm not going to comment on your particular tax, but nearly every country has exemptions from paying tax up to a certain level. And very few countries actually have a land tax. One exception is Poland, which does have a land tax, but it's relatively small, for €4 per hectare, and the average size of farm in Poland is only 9 hectares, so it's not a big tax burden. Plus the fact they don't have income tax on farming. So some countries have exemptions for certain groups. Some in Sweden have exemptions for young farmers. They have exemptions for old farmers, elderly farmers. And in the UK, we have exemptions for cooperatives that are trading with their own members. There's 0% tax. So each country designs its own tax policy. However, having said all that, there is a simplified accounting system for small farmers in almost every country. And we do have a common agricultural policy, which is common to every single EU member state. And in order to be part of that common agricultural policy, there's some basic principles that have to be in place in every single country. And when I look at Ukraine, those principles are not in place. The first thing we would look for in any accession country or member state country is a law on agriculture, which gives all the definitions that apply to agriculture. And it's a specific law for agriculture, not for small enterprises or whatever. It's a law on agriculture. And there's some basic things that are in that law, which includes things like the definition of a farmer. And I don't know how it's being translated here, but for us, the definition of a farmer is the same in every single EU country. And we use the international FAO terminology, which basically says a family farm, not small farm, I apologize, is one that is managed and operated by a household and where the farm labor is largely supplied by that household. So that is the definition we use in the European Union. Now, if you applied that to Ukraine, you're talking about 4 million people who are not even officially registered as farmers, family farmers in your country. So, you know, this is for us extremely strange. You only use an enterprise register as the register of farming enterprises, of which there's only 44,000 enterprises that are registered. And if you compare that to Poland, that has 1.5 million farms registered, and you compare it to, you're on the same level as Belgium and Latvia, who have about 40,000 farms registered. So I think, first of all, you've got to define who you see as a farmer. And then the second question is, these 4 million households that we would see as family farms are actually supplying the majority of your production. Now, you call it illegal, you call it a shadow market, you can call it what you like, but 98% of potatoes, for example, are produced by these farms. 75% of dairy products, etc., etc. So you can call it informal, but for me, it is the market. It is the agricultural production of the country. So the question I would ask is, what is wrong? Are the farmers wrong by not registering, or is the system wrong by not allowing them to register in a simple way, or not wanting to register in a simple way? The next thing we would expect all member states to have is a strategy for the development of agriculture in rural areas for the next 7 years. Every country has to have that. It has to be approved by the European Union. It has to be developed and designed by the member state itself. So each country submits a slightly different plan according to their circumstances, but they have to submit a plan. Now, again, when I look at Ukraine, I don't see a plan. I mean, what kind of agricultural system do you want in 10 years' time? Do you want small farmers at all? Do you want larger farmers? How do you vision what it's going to look like? And then when you have a vision, you can then decide what support you will give to certain categories or groups. And again, we don't normally tax on land because, as I think Oleh pointed out, it's gross margin per hectare, which is important. You can make a lot of money on 1 hectare of strawberries, for example, as they do in Holland and other countries. So it's the productivity and the gross margin which is important, and it's normally the countries look at that, and that is what they tax. And in order to do that, each country has to keep a farm accountancy data network, which assesses for all products how much gross margin per hectare farmers are actually getting. And then it's on the basis of that that the countries normally make their tax policy. There are a number of other things which I think you are missing. One is a very clear and transparent state subsidy support program. In Europe, we pay farmers, we don't tax them just on their land, we pay them a direct farm payment according to how much hectares that they have. And in order for them to receive that payment, they have to meet certain standards of animal welfare or good agricultural practices. In the UK, we don't see these people just as farmers. We also see them as custodians of the landscape. They are looking after, as far as we are concerned in the UK anyway, they are looking after the land. They are the people who are looking after the countryside. And if they do certain things which the state tells them they need to do, like plant hedgerows or, I don't know, look after biodiversity or whatever, then they get paid in order to do that. There are also more than 100 schemes available across Europe for small farmers, small rural businesses to access in order to get grants and support for developing their businesses. So in many ways, we think you're missing a real opportunity to develop certain crops in certain regions in a very positive way if you targeted your subsidy support program in a better way and did it through a proper, accredited, transparent payments mechanism. And it would yield real benefits in areas where you're not strong. You're strong in cereals, you're strong in oilseeds, you're world leaders in these things, but there's other crops that you're way behind the rest of the world. And it's mainly added value, high value crops, which small farmers, family farmers are normally the ones that produce those things because they produce better quality products. They, in many ways, they're better for the soil, for the landscape. They provide to villages, they provide food security in many cases. And these are really people that in your country are underdeveloped. You have people leaving rural areas, you have young people leaving rural areas, they see no future in farming. There's a lot of poverty in these regions, and these are issues that the government should try and address. And farming and small farming is one way of really helping to address that problem. And then the one last point I would make is every EU country has to have what we call an agricultural knowledge and innovation service. Basically, this means that every single farmer that is on a farm register, not an enterprise register, a farm register, is able to access information, clear information, advice, training in their regions and in their villages. And there is a requirement for every EU member state to do that. So having not mentioned your taxation proposals, it's not my job to do that, but I think somebody has to take a much broader look at the whole picture of how you want agriculture to develop in the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And now, dear colleagues, do you have any questions or feedback to John Mills and his intervention? Then can I ask Dmytro now? So your Agrarian Council, have you estimated the effect of the draft law, the impact on the economy? What will be the benefit, the impact on the Ukrainian economy in the context of local communities, for example? In the context of local communities, well, I cannot mention an exact figure, unfortunately, I don't have my presentation here, but it will be plus 9 billion hryvnias, which will be the income of local communities. And that will result in construction of roads and creation of jobs. And that is what is being done, because one of problems in the villages is jobs, and young people leave because there are no jobs, and here you have additional revenues to develop your communities. This is about roads and hospitals, etc. So that's the positive effect. Yes, some will have to pay extra. We will take money from somebody's pocket, but I don't care so much because, well, actually, we know about those who cultivate like 200 hectares without paying anything, totally informally. So it's not about some minor practices, and of course, shadow or informal sector exists everywhere. But we need to avoid the situation where it is most of it, where agrarian companies pay everything and some pay nothing. So yes, they will have to pay something out of their pocket. And if you compare what actually is being paid formally and informally, what needs to be paid informally, you will see that as a result you will have more balance in the market. And that's important. So money will go to the communities and that will create competitive advantages. Now, Mr. Nivievskyi, could you share your opinion? What will be the impact of this tax initiative? Actually, I mentioned that already. How much communities will get additionally, we don't know that because we don't have adequate statistical data to estimate that. Yes, we mentioned that at the beginning of our discussion. And secondly, as I mentioned, based on our estimations, the shrinking of GDP, while all the other factors are fixed, will be minus from 10 to 18 million US dollars. And this innovation will reduce the cultivation land, the area of land cultivated by individuals by about 1 million hectares. And this is what I see. Moreover, since we are only kind of attacking the consequences, but not the roots of the problem, that's another problem there. And that will only actually intensify the problems that we have now. But let's take an example, because we have figures from Vladimir. So let us ask Vladimir. He has 13 hectares and he will pay 200 hryvnias extra. So it is about 2,400 a year. This is hryvnia. 2,400 plus annually. This is what Volodymyr will pay extra to the local budget. So the question is whether you are really going to reduce your production, whether you are going to leave the market. No, he will continue working. But look, you are experts. And for example, if it is a poor harvest, if you fail to sell your products, what's next? Well, this is what we are going to have this year. Maybe you don't know that, but this year we are going to encounter this huge problem of droughts in southern regions. In Odessa region, a lot of winter crops have died and have disappeared, especially Bessarabia. 80% of their winter crops died. And they will have to pay VAT on their input materials. They have loans, they have borrowings, and now tax administration says that you need to write off everything, all of your losses, all of your damages, and you need to pay extra. So now, happily, there is a working group in the Ministry of Finance, and we were members to that working group, and actually they have prepared draft resolution where in this situation it would be possible to make it so that these farmers don't have to pay taxes on this kind of products. And there are also chambers of commerce, and there are respective certificates. So there are tools where it is possible to prove why you shouldn't pay your taxes. plus lost income. For example, if you have this problem, you can go to a Chamber of Commerce and get the certificate and prove that you just couldn't pay on that. So we worked a lot to develop this transparent mechanism, and we will provide information support. We will explain it to agrarians how to use that. But definitely, if there is a problem, you need to contribute and help address it. But nobody is going to really deprive anyone of the last hryvnia. If I may ask a question, maybe to Dmytro, on social media they are asking us how many large businesses or those renters who have a lot of land, how many of them pay single taxes. Well, there are no large individual owners in Group 4. Let me just explain that individual sole proprietor, individual entrepreneur, it is where they register as family farms, and they can have up to 20 hectares, so they cannot be large. But what about the number? But if these are legal entities, there are legal entities in Group 4, but that's legal and fair, and I don't know why that question. Well, that could be to some extent about some privileges, but let's see. The tax on Group 4, based on my estimations, that's up to 10% versus the profit tax, so which is 18%. And we remember about those 20 million hectares that are officially cultivated, and 90 million of that is Group 4. Even agri holdings are there in that category. Okay, that's a complicated topic. I understand that you have had long discussions on these topics, but for us, as specialists in communications, it's important to raise these issues, to have public discussion on that. And we have heard a lot of different figures, some were conflicting, and I understand that it requires further discussions, and maybe really we will, as mentioned by the MP, we will receive some official figures at the state level. But now to wrap up, could you mention optimistically some steps that need to be undertaken for to avoid informal production, and maybe some recommendations for SMEs, for independent producers? Who would like to start? Well, optimistically speaking, we need to de-shadow the sector to the extent possible. We need to deal with those large entities. Well, actually, draft law 3131, it's not about countering or fighting independent producers, because independent producers, if they work in the informal sector, that's one story. They're just those who work informally. But if they work in a fair way, in a transparent way, they should not be accused of anything, because sometimes they mention independent producers as kind of tax evaders. So it is important to de-shadow this sector. It is important to bring everyone to formal sector where people register as family farms or as individual proprietors, etc., so that they could have access to state support. Because we know about that so-called farmer billion. Every year they allocate 1 billion to support farmers, and every year even half of that is not disbursed because there is no one to apply, while the state does allocate that to support farmers. So if there are problems, we need to address those, but we need to support small farmers for their development. So the shadowing, registration, state support, and something what is also very much important and what we try to promote, hopefully it will be voted this week. It is adopting in second reading of the draft law on cooperation, on cooperatives, because we have only 1% of products that are produced by cooperatives, while in advanced countries it could be up to 70%. In the US it is like 50%. While we don't have those cooperatives because we have a model that is not viable. So we need to come up with a new model where farmers efficiently come together so that they could sell their products to cooperatives, so that they could avoid problems as Volodymyr has, so that they could come together and sell their products in large batches and get their fair profit, so that they could also use the economy of scale and procure fertilizers, etc. So cooperation, it is a key prerequisite for development of small and medium farms. So draft law 8056, if I'm not mistaken, it is supposed to be voted this week, and this is a new model, and we also contributed into that. We worked with European, American, Canadian experts, with local experts, and we are looking forward to that. That will give it an impetus. We have a cooperative, our organization. It brings together members of our organization. We do it for the same reason. We use the economy of scale. So far, it is only for procurement, but for sales, it is not yet possible to use that model. And I also believe that it is key that we need to have some mutual understanding, common grounds. It is good that we have this discussion, and I believe that all parties and participants in this discussion, we want to develop the sector. Maybe we have some different visions to some extent, but it's good that we have the same target, the same idea. This is to develop the multi-dimensional agri sector in Ukraine. And thank you for this discussion today. Thanks to organizers. Thank you, Mr. Nivievskyi. Could you reiterate your recommendations? What, how? To reiterate that, well, you asked me about some positive aspects. Let me mention something positive just to make it different. So the positive thing is that we have civil society that is able to convey some flaws of our lawmakers and some problems and flaws of our legislation. So to a great extent, due to civil society, due to experts, we have some response and feedback to legislative initiatives. So at least they revised, they amended the initial version of this draft law, and hopefully they will still step back from that idea to introduce this minimal tax. So that's a positive thing, and that's an important asset. Speaking about recommendations, and again, let me reiterate that minimal tax, it is where we fight consequences, not the roots of that. And we need instead to explore the problem of deshadowing, where the root is, and respond to that. And in addition to that, there are also some other legislative acts that need to be adopted, and they will help to address the issue. This is the draft law on transfer of land for communal property and the draft law on agrarian registry, as mentioned by John also in his intervention. And also I would like them to withdraw that minimal 7-year term for the contracts, rental contracts. And also I believe that it is important to go deeper to explore the supply chain, not focus on producers only, and also provide access for funding, for loans, to loans for SMEs. because when they work with banks, they tend to formalize their procedures. This is not an exhaustive list, but if we develop this comprehensive approach, that will result in some effect. While these ad hoc initiatives, that is like when you try to cut off your appendix with a garden knife or whatever. So in this way, you will not really support the sector as a whole. Thank you. Now, anyone else who would like to add something to them? John, Volodymyr, Ruslan? Now, thank you for your active participation. Thank you for your time in this busy period. And you, again, can see the video recording of our discussion on the website of the Crisis Center, and we will come up with proceedings. Thank you and goodbye.